In this video, we're going to look at the foreign exchange market. A lot of times you'll see it just called the FOREX. Same thing as the foreign exchange. And so we're going to look at our last major graph for AP Macro. Now when we talk about exchange rate, we're simply talking about the relative price of currencies. And what we mean by that is when we're talking exchange rate, we're always comparing one currency to another. So one country's currency to another country's currency. Now throughout the semester we've talked about exports and imports. We see some examples here on the screen. The U.S. sells cars to Mexico. Canada buys or sells syrup to the United States. Now for all of these transactions, each country has its own currency, and so each country must be paid in their own currency. So the buyer, the person that's importing the product, has to exchange their currency to the currency of the seller or the exporter for the transaction to take place. And so this is where exchange rates come into play. So in the Forex market, we're only looking at two countries or two currencies at a time. That's why we say it's the relative price of currencies. The price of the US dollar compared to the British pound may be different than the price of the US dollar to the euro or to the Japanese yen. All right, so for this example that we'll look at throughout this video, we'll stick with the US dollars and British pounds. Right, and so I'll give you an example. $2 equals 1 British pound. It's not the exact exchange rate today, but we're just using that for example's sake. So the exchange rate is going to really depend on which currency you're trying to convert your money to. So for example, the price of 1 US dollar in terms of British pounds is half a pound. The price of 1 pound in terms of dollars would be $2. So 1 pound would be worth $2, $1 would be worth half a pound. So what happens if you need to, more dollars to buy 1 British pound? So or the price of the British pound increases. Right? So instead of $2 for every British pound, it's now $5 for every British pound. Well, what has just happened is that the US dollar has depreciated relative to the British pound. And so whenever we talk about a currency depreciating or a currency becoming weaker, it's just simply lost value relative or in respect to that other country's currency. So when the dollar depreciates, we need more dollars to buy a single currency from that other country. So in this case, we went from only needing $2 to purchase 1 British pound when we exchange currencies to now needing $5 to purchase or to buy, to exchange for 1 British pound. Now, the other side of that scenario, what happens if you need less dollars to buy 1 pound? So instead of needing $2 to purchase 1 British pound, it's now you only need $1, and that $1 gets you 4 British pounds. Well, in this scenario, the US dollar appreciates or has gotten stronger in value. So it's an increased value. We now need less dollars to buy that currency. Now on the screen here you can see the graph for foreign exchange market. Point out a couple of the key things for this and talk about a couple of tips as you work on problems. Now one thing with the foreign exchange market, like we said, you're always looking at two currencies. So this is one graph, and this graph happens to be for US dollars. Now you can see that it's the price of US dollars, and down at the bottom it's the quantity of US dollars. But you can also see along the axis the comparison, what we would be exchanging. In this case it's British pounds for US dollars. Now you can see we've labeled our demand and supply with tags of demand by the British. The British would be the ones who would be demanding the US dollar. Americans would be supplying the US dollar. One tip that I always recommend when working with the foreign exchange market is you always want to draw two graphs. So you'd want to draw one that represents US dollars And you can always then draw the other currencies graph. So you could also draw the supply and demand for British pounds. And there it would be the demand by Americans, supply by the British, the price of the British pound, quantity of the British pound. Now, a couple of things that you'll see, if they give you an exchange rate and say that this is the current exchange rate, then you'll always want to set that at the equilibrium point, right? And then you can also see up here, right? This is how you need to label the side. So you can put price of US dollar, but then you also want to put pound over dollars. The currency that you're actually looking at, the graph of, is always going to go down in the denominator when you're dealing with those currencies. Now, a couple of other things we can see on these graphs. Anytime that equilibrium point moves above the starting equilibrium point, so once we've introduced what the shifters are, that means that the currency has appreciated. So the US dollar appreciates. If it goes below, then that's a sign that, in this case, the US dollar depreciates. Now, one of the reasons why I always recommend drawing the US dollar graph and then the British graph side by side, if the demand by British increases on the US dollar graph, then that means that the supply by the British of British pounds would also increase. What that shows you is that if the US dollar appreciates, then the British pound would always have to depreciate. It would always have to do the opposite. So again, it's a way you can kind of self-check by making sure that you've got both graphs right, even if they're only asking for what happens to the US dollar or what happens to the British pound. By drawing both, it can be an easy way just to double check to make sure you've done it correctly. So let's look at what the shifters are. And again, we'll stick with the US dollar and British pound as we go through the four shifters of the foreign exchange or the FOREX market. So the first one is change in taste. Very similar to our original supply and demand, and after all, this is all foreign exchange graph is just a supply and demand of a particular currency. So change in taste and preferences. So an example we'll look at is British tourists flock to the United States. So when the British tourists come to the United States, they're going to have to demand US dollars. And in exchange for those dollars that they're demanding, they're going to have to supply British pounds. So on the US dollar graph, the demand would shift to the right. On the British pound graph, the supply would shift to the right. What we see is that in this example, the pound depreciates or gets weaker, and the dollar appreciates or gets stronger. Second shift is a change in relative income. All right, so we're assuming one country's now has more income compared or relative to the other country. Again, what we've said all along is that means that they can now import more goods, and so that's where we're going to see the impact on the foreign exchange market. So in this example, the U.S. growth increases U.S. income. So people in the U.S. have more income relative to those in Great Britain. What that means is the U.S. is going to buy more imports. To buy those imports, we're going to have to convert our money into British pounds to pay for that transaction. So the U.S. demand for the pound increases. The supply of U.S. dollars increases. And so what we have here is an example where the pound appreciates or gets stronger, and the dollar depreciates or gets weaker. Our third shifter is changes in relative price levels. Again, this is going to link just like changes in relative income level. It's going to result in more imports. So if there's a U.S. price increase relative to Great Britain, our products are now going to be more expensive relative to those of Great Britain. So the U.S. is going to demand cheaper imports. And so the U.S. is going to demand more pounds to pay for those cheaper imports. If we demand more pounds, that means we're going to have to supply more U.S. dollars, which means in this example, the pound appreciates and the dollar depreciates or gets weaker. The last shifter is changes in relative interest rates. So in this example, we'll assume that the U.S. has higher interest rates than Great Britain. If the U.S. has higher interest rates than Great Britain, then the British are going to be more prone to invest in the United States rather than Great Britain. Again, you always want to invest where you can receive the highest rate of return, or the highest interest rate. And so for the British people to invest in the United States or into U.S. banks, that means more money is coming towards the United States. So the British are going to have to demand more U.S. dollars because they couldn't put the British pounds into U.S. banks. They would first have to convert it to U.S. dollars. If the British demand for U.S. dollars increases, that means the British are going to have to supply more pounds, which means the pound depreciates and the dollar appreciates. That's just a quick overview of the foreign exchange market, our last major graph of AP Macro, as well as the 4 shifters for this graph. We'll do some more practice with this in class, going through some scenarios that you might expect to see, and just some practice with drawing and working with these graphs. Until next time.